Of course, when I was younger, there were so many things I wanted to do. I think the first one, I wanted to be an actor. I think that's why I like doing things like this, because I'm talking to people. I love talking to people. Well, in those days, I couldn't make enough money as an actor. I did a little acting, but it didn't pay that well. I also wanted to be in the advertising business. I love ads. When I read a magazine, I usually spend as much time reading the advertisements as whatever the magazine has. Then I thought, when I was very young, I wanted to be a lawyer, because I had gone to a movie. Oh, I must have been about 10 years old. And there was one scene with a lawyer, and he was speaking so beautifully, and he was swaying the jury, and everybody thought he was so wonderful. And I thought, boy, it must be great to be able to get up there in front of a jury and have somebody set free or convicted if you're the DA. I didn't realize that the talking you do is the least of it. Most of it is paperwork and studying, so I didn't become a lawyer. And when I was very young, I wanted to be the usual, a policeman, a fireman, a cowboy. Everything, the whole world seemed exciting to me. And I've got to tell you, it still does. You know, it's a funny thing. Today, comic book writers get really a lot of respect because people know that so many motion pictures are based on what they're writing. But boy, was it different years ago when I started. Nobody cared about comic books. Nobody had any respect for them. I remember I'd go to a cocktail party, let's say, with my wife, and somebody would walk over to me, a stranger, and he'd say, "What do you do?" Boy, I knew it was coming. I'd say, "Oh, I'm a writer," and I tried to walk away, but he'd follow me and, "Oh, what do you write?" I still tried to avoid the ultimate outcome, and I would say, "Oh, I write magazine stories." Kept walking away, kept following me. "Well, what kind of magazine stories? For what magazines?" At some point, I had to say comic books. Immediately, the interest ended. The guy would turn around, walk in the other direction. Of course, now it's totally different. Now it's, excuse me, Tom Cruise, I think that's Stan Lee over there. I've got to talk to him. He writes comic books. I'm only kidding. I think the one bit of advice that I would give anybody who wants to get into the comic book business as a writer would be, don't try to just write comics. The most important thing is be a good writer and then try to write comics. But you've got to know characterization. You've got to be able to describe things well. You've got to understand plotting. You've got to understand how to maintain a reader's interest, how to keep up the suspense. You've got to understand pacing. Now, all those things apply whether you're writing a novel, a motion picture, a television series, a comic book. So don't just concentrate on comics. First, learn the craft of writing, and then try to do comics. Same thing applies to artists. First, become a really good artist. Learn perspective, learn layout, anatomy, learn how to move the figure. As a matter of fact, being a comic book artist is probably the most difficult type of artwork there is, because you have to be able to draw everything. As a comic book artist, one story may deal with aliens on another planet, and you've got to draw them so they look believable. At least the reader must think they're aliens on another planet. You may have to draw another story that takes place in a subway, on a bridge, in an airport, in a gambling casino, in Paris, in Shanghai. I mean, you've got to be able to draw everything and anything. Most of the comic book artists I know started when they were very young, and they carried a sketchbook with them. And wherever they were, they would sketch the places they were at. They would sketch the people passing by. They'd sketch anything that looked interesting. I have the utmost respect for comic book artists, because they have to be so incredibly talented to really do a good job. I couldn't keep an artist standing around with nothing to do, but I couldn't stop what I was doing and write a different script. So I would say, look, Jack, I tell you what, I can't write the whole script, but here's the story that I want to tell. And I would describe the story in a couple of minutes. I'd say, you go home and draw it any way you want. When you bring in the artwork, I'll fill in the dialogue and the captions. And then I would do that for John Romita, or for John Buscema, or for Gene Colan, or Gil Kane. And that way, I could keep a lot of artists busy at the same time. Then when they brought the artwork in, I had it lying on a table in front of me, and all I had to do was put in the dialogue and the captions. Now, I don't want to make that sound too easy, because to me, putting in the dialogue is one of the most important things. That's what gives you the characterization. But it's a lot easier to do that than to sit and write a full script. So that was my little trick. And in that way, we were able to turn out a lot of magazines every month. Those artists were the equivalent of directors of photography, layout men, and even associate writers, because what they would do, I'd give them the idea for the story, but then they told the story in their own way. So they understood pacing, they understood how to give so much space to the beginning, the middle, the end, how to keep the suspense going. They threw a lot of ideas in that I hadn't even given them. And that made it fun for me, because when I was putting in the copy, very often I'd see some drawings and I didn't even know what they were. But I had to figure out a way to make sense of them. It was almost like doing a crossword puzzle. And I think that's what kept my interest up all the time. I never could get bored, because I never knew what to expect when the artwork came in. And I found it always very challenging, and I love puzzles, so it was a lot of fun. A lot of people ask me, why am I still working this hard, and why don't I retire? Well, I've often, if you think about it, I've often thought, when you retire, you usually say to yourself, at last, I don't have to do that work anymore. Now I can do what I've always wanted to do. Well, the thing is, I'm doing what I've always wanted to do. I'm writing stories. I'm sort of out of the comic book business for the most part, and I'm working on movies and television now. But I'm working with other screenwriters. I'm working with directors, with producers. I'm coming up with ideas for movies, for television series. I've never had more fun. If I were retired, I'd be wanting to do what I'm doing now. I'm lucky enough to be doing it. I don't have to want to. You know, I think a great villain needs the same characteristics as a great hero. A, he has to be somewhat believable. He has to act credibly and always stay in character. B, he has to be colorful. If he's just a guy who's a litterbug or a jaywalker, you're not going to care. So there has to be some sort of a colorful crime that he wants to execute, and hopefully he wants to execute the crime in some colorful way. It helps if he has a very unique superpower. As with heroes, you want to give him a great personality. Every character you write about, whether a hero or a villain or an incidental character, you want to try to make them as interesting, as colorful, as different as possible. It doesn't hurt occasionally to build a little pathos for the villain into the story, where you might even feel a little sorry for him when he meets his untimely or perhaps his timely end. By the same token, you never want to build too much sympathy for the villain. I never want to make the mistake of making the villain seem nicer or more glamorous than the hero. You never want the reader to feel, gee, I wish I was like the villain, because then I think you're doing a disservice to mankind writing those kind of stories. I would hope every story I've ever written would make the reader want to be the hero and not the villain. If you have a masked villain running through a number of episodes, and then you unmask him, should it be somebody that we've seen before, or should he end up being a perfect stranger? In a story, I think a reader would be cheated if the villain turned out to be a character that had never appeared in the story before. Even though most of the villains have colorful costumes or they may wear masks, in their normal identity, they look fairly much like regular people. You know, they're not monstrous looking. And I think the reason that we always tried to do that is because in real life, most bad people are just, they look like ordinary people. That's what they are. They're ordinary people who went bad. And again, I don't think they'd be credible enough if they were all misshapen, ugly, monstrous type of people. Lots of people wonder, which is the best way really to tell a superhero story? Using comic books or through the motion picture? Well, both of them have advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, the disadvantage of a comic book is that you can't hear the voices. You can't see the people move. But the disadvantage of the movie, and you may never have thought of this, you can't see the thought balloons. And when I used to write the comics, I went crazy with thought balloons. I would try to put as many thought bubbles in as I could, because I liked the reader to know what the character is thinking. If you know what a character is thinking most of the time, you get to know that character better. You understand him, and you can relate to him or her. In a movie, you can't constantly have a character talking to himself. You can't show little bubbles above his head. So it's up to the actor, by his facial expressions and his body language, to try to depict what his feelings are. My two favorite villains for Spider-Man were Doc Ock and the Green Goblin. I figured that they gave him more trouble than almost anybody. Doc Ock, with those tentacles of his that he could extend them and use them to go to a third-floor window if he had to. He could wrap them around Spider-Man and crush him. He could use them as weapons. And he was the usual mad scientist. I love mad scientists. I think if not for mad scientists, I wouldn't be able to write any stories. And then, of course, there was the Green Goblin. I always loved him because he was a Jekyll and Hyde character. He was this great businessman, this industrialist. He was also a mad villain who could fly on that goblin glider and drop those pumpkin bombs. And although I must admit I loved them all. I loved the Sandman. I loved the Kingpin. I loved, as I may have mentioned, I'm my biggest fan. I love everything I've written. I have never set out to affect people. All I ever set out to do was write stories that I hoped the readers would enjoy. And in the beginning, the only thing I hoped was that they would enjoy the stories, therefore they would buy the books, therefore I would keep my job and not get fired, therefore I could keep paying the rent. And, I mean, it was only years later that I would hear people say how much these stories might have affected them. But at the time of writing them, my only interest was just to write a good story, which hopefully would be well received by the readers. I had created quite a number of heroes before Daredevil. There was Peter Parker, Spider-Man, who had all sorts of personal problems. In fact, all of my characters had personal problems or hang-ups or handicaps of some sort. So my job was to keep creating superheroes, so when I had to do a new one, the first thing I thought of was, what kind of handicap can I give somebody? Now, I think I had already done the mighty Thor, the Thunder God, And in his human identity, he limped, he was lame, and used a cane. And all of them had something. Iron Man had a weak heart. I had very strange heroes. At any rate, it occurred to me, what if I had a hero who was blind? Because I had known a blind person who I marveled at his ability to function in many ways. And he seemed to hear better than most people because he had his hearing had to be sensitive because he depended on it so much. And I thought, if I could get a blind man who developed his other senses to an extravagant degree, who had super senses, and show that he could function better than a sighted man, even though he was blind. And that idea fascinated me. I remember I thought, if his sense of touch was incredibly sensitive, he wouldn't need Braille, but he could run his finger over a newspaper and the ink itself, he could feel that. So he could read just by doing that, read a page faster than a sighted man could. And I felt he could even tell if you were lying, because his hearing would be so acute that he could hear if your heartbeat was speeding up and your pulse. Therefore, it was like having a built-in lie detector. And I began to think of all these qualities. You know, your sense of balance comes from your ear. A tightrope walker or someone like that, they use their balance from their ear. So if his hearing was so acute, he could do anything that a circus performer could do. He could be a trapeze star, a tightrope walker, and so forth. He could walk on telephone wires from the poles in the street. I began to think of all the scenes we could get. The more I thought about it, the more I loved this character. And I must say, I still do. As you probably know, once you have the superhero identity, you have to figure, well, what does the hero do in his normal civilian life? So I thought, and I always like to try to do something different, as most writers do. I thought, what type of occupation in civilian life isn't any other hero involved in? And I thought, gee, you know, if I made him a lawyer, first of all, there are no other lawyers in comics that I knew of. And secondly, I could get some interesting story plots just because, and I could find reasons for him to get involved with villains because people could come to him with cases, tell him some terrible thing that happened and they need help, not knowing he's a hero. And also, I could use him as a guest star in other books because whenever somebody needed a lawyer, they could go to Matt Murdock. So I thought the idea of him being a lawyer was great. And when I was a kid, I had seen a movie, I think it was called The Great Mouthpiece, about a lawyer. And he stood up there in front of the jury and he made impassioned speeches and he got his defendants who were all innocent, he got them off. And I thought, you know, I'm a very corny guy. I thought, how dramatic to be able to go up there and make a speech. It's like being an actor. So I always think, I think I always wanted to be a lawyer in the back of my mind. It never occurred to me it's also hard work and you've got to sit with text and read reviews and reports. I just thought you make speeches and I love doing that. So I made him a lawyer. And today, a lot of lawyers are very unpopular. But when I did that, I guess it was about 40 years ago, lawyers were just like anybody else. Over the years, so many different writers have written Spider-Man and changed him a little bit. Each new writer has a different take on him. Each new writer has had a different take on Daredevil. All I can tell you about is, in the beginning, when I first wrote the Spider-Man stories and the Daredevil stories in the beginning, Daredevil was an adult, and he was very interested in helping other people who had problems as a lawyer and as a superhero. He was in love with a girl. Her name was Karen Page, I believe. She was his partner and he had a firm called Nelson and Murdoch. He was partnered with Foggy Nelson, and this girl, Karen, was their secretary. She loved him and he loved her, but he wouldn't marry her because he felt it was unfair to ask her to marry a blind man, not realizing she would have given anything to be his wife. So I had that romance going. Now, I think over the years that's changed. I think Karen has changed and a lot has happened. But in those days, he was a grown-up with a real romance. When I wrote Peter Parker, Spider-Man, he was a teenager. He wasn't quite as interested in helping other people who came to him for help. It didn't work that way. He was mostly fighting people who, for their own reason, wanted to destroy Spider-Man. And simply because he was Spider-Man, he had so many enemies. His romances were a little bit lighter. There were girls he liked, might have thought he loved, but as a teenager, he went from one to another. And finally, after a number of years, I had to marry this girl, Mary Jane. So there was a difference in feeling. Daredevil, I think, was always a little bit more serious. Spider-Man had more humor to it. I had him wisecracking a lot. And the stories in some ways were lighter. And aside from that, there was a great similarity, though, because they both fought very colorful, costumed villains. And I always felt if you have a young teenager and he's fighting villains who are enormously powerful, that's interesting. And if you have a blind attorney and he's fighting villains who are colorful and powerful, that's interesting too. So because of the fact that they were two basically normal people, I tried to give both of them villains who were very much they were exaggerated in every way, in their power and in their appearance. And I must say, I have a great love for both Spider-Man and Daredevil. Obviously, Spider-Man and Daredevil are friends. And it was the most natural thing in the world for me to make all our superheroes. See, one thing we did that was different than other comic book companies, I placed all these characters in the same world and in the same city. They all were in New York, which made it easy for them to run into each other and guest star in each other's books. Now, by having them all living in essentially the same place, and by having them all do essentially the same things, what could be more natural than to make them friends, especially when they would meet and have to fight together? Of course, I also did a lot of stories where, due to misunderstandings, they would get mad at each other, or one might think another one had committed a crime. Couldn't believe it, but still he knew he had to go after him, and that always made it interesting, and it was always a surprise to the readers. And one of the most important things you can do in writing these sort of stories is surprise the readers. But there was something about Spider-Man and Daredevil that I felt they were so similar in so many ways that I wanted them to definitely be friends. And I'm happy to say it worked out that way in the books. I have never really eavesdropped on Spider-Man and Daredevil when they were alone. I felt it wouldn't be right. I mean, even a hero needs his privacy. But I'm going to take a guess about what they would talk about when they got together for a sandwich or something somewhere. I would guess the first thing they would talk about were the last few villains that they had come up against. And being normal people, both of them, my guess is they would each try to top the other. Hey, your fight against Kingpin, yeah, that was okay. You did a good job. But you should have seen me against the Green Goblin. Man, that was really something. You know, at least that's the way I would write their dialogue if I was writing it. After they finish talking about the various fights they've had with the various villains, I would imagine that they'd start talking about their personal lives. Hey, how's Mary Jane? Are you still seeing her? Is everything okay? Yeah, fine. And what about Karen? When are you two going to get married? And what, things like that. Well, after they had run through that, I imagine they'd talk about sports, politics, and at some point they'd get bored and they'd figure that's enough. And they'd figure, okay, that's long enough. There must be some bad guys out there I ought to be fighting. And they would take off. All imaginary on my part. The one thing about being the writer and the editor and art director of these books, which I was in the beginning, is you're a little bit like God. You can create anything, you can kill anything, you can say that character's too short, I'll make him taller, or you can change anything. Well, when we did the Daredevil story, the first one, that was illustrated by Bill Everett, a very talented artist, a good friend of mine. He had created the Submariner character years ago. And I let Bill create whatever costume that he wanted for Daredevil. And he gave him that costume, which was mostly yellow. And I somehow, after the first issue, or the first couple of issues, it just didn't seem dramatic enough. And I thought the word devil, and when you think of devil, you think of flames, you think of Hades, and so forth. And I said, let's give him a red costume. So as I say, being the art director, if I wanted to give him a red costume, they gave me a red costume. So we redesigned a red costume, and I liked that one much better. And it was just as simple as that. I thought that the yellow just was it was a little too old-fashioned comic booky. Now, certainly any costume is comic booky, but I thought the red was more dramatic. The Marvel characters come in all sizes and shapes and varied assortments. Some of them just seem to fit so beautifully in teams, like the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and even Iron Man and Captain America, who are part of the Avengers, and so forth. But some characters seem better suited to be loners. They could meet other characters, they could guest star in other books, but generally, I might be wrong, but the way I felt was Daredevil and Spider-Man should always be loners. In fact, I remember I wrote a story once where Spider-Man wanted to join the Fantastic Four, and he applied, and he was very surprised when he learned they didn't pay salaries to people. So he left and decided to be a loner. But I can't explain why. It's just a feeling I have. Daredevil by himself is a very dramatic and a very engrossing character. And I think he'd sort of lose a lot of his uniqueness if he were part of a team. And the thing about Spider-Man, he's always been a loner, and I feel he should be. I know that Kingpin originally first appeared in the Spider-Man series. He was a Spider-Man villain. Then, before we knew it, he was one of Daredevil's top villains. And it just happened. See, I was very generous with the villains. I would give them to any superhero that needed one or wanted one. And we did. We had the villains move back and forth. I had a villain named Dr. Doom who had appeared with every character at some time or other, and a lot of them. But somehow, when we first put Kingpin in with Daredevil, it worked so well because Daredevil was such a realistic character, being a lawyer, being blind. I mean, he seemed so real. And of all the villains, because of the fact that he didn't wear a costume, and he lived in the city, and he was just a gangster, although nobody knew it, to the world he was a big businessman, it seemed this lawyer and this businessman worked so well together in a series, and nobody knew the lawyer was really Daredevil, the businessman was really the Kingpin, and he became one of Daredevil's top villains. I guess heroes are people who help other people, who do things for other people. And man, that can refer to a mother, a father, a child. It certainly refers to firemen, policemen, soldiers. But anybody can be a hero. Anybody who helps another human being, or even an animal. I mean, anybody who puts himself or herself out to help someone else is doing something that's heroic. Now, in comic books, we call them superheroes because they do more than a normal man can. Just for fun, we give them superpowers. But again, a hero is somebody who helps others and who is admirable, who you'd look up to and you'd say, gee, I wish I were like that, or I'd like my children to be like that. To me, that's a hero. I had school teachers who I think were heroes because they inspired me and they made me want to be as good as I could be at whatever I did. Now, those teachers didn't get any prizes and there weren't books written about them, but as far as I'm concerned, they were very heroic. They gave of their time and energy. They cared about their students, and they did the best they could for them. And I mean, you could be a supermarket checkout clerk and be a hero in your own way if you're good to the people that you work with. Anybody could be a hero, I think. I'm going to let you in on a real secret now, and this must go no further. Any of you who are listening to this on the DVD, you are pledged to silence. A villain is only as dangerous as the writer who writes him makes him be. If I were writing a story with any villain, and for some reason I wanted to end the story with the villain defeating Spider-Man, I would find a way to do that, and then that villain would be his most dangerous opponent. So it really, even though we think of these as real characters, a lot depends on who's writing them. You know, I think one of the reasons for Venom's great popularity, and there are many reasons, but one of the reasons I think is he's so unique. There's really never been a villain like Venom, because he's somebody who can take over a person's personality. Well, we've seen that happen before with hypnotists and things of that sort, but we've never seen it happen visually, where another type of being literally flows over the person and becomes the person and changes the person. Visually, Venom is a great character, and the way Venom does what he does is so startlingly exciting when you look at it that he has to be one of the most unique and one of the most scary villains of all time. You know, it's an interesting thought. If I found a creature like that, a symbiotic creature who could give me superpowers but make me somewhat evil, would I accept that rather strange gift? I think I might try it because I'm just conceited enough to think that my willpower is so strong that I could overcome his influence, and I would just take the power but still remain the wonderful human being that I am. Wow, you know, if that suit had been attached to the Hulk, I don't think the story would have had a happy ending, because the Hulk is a rampaging beast at any rate. Luckily, he stops being the Hulk at a certain time. But if he had that suit, and if he was not only rampaging,
but incredibly evil, then I wouldn't go out in the street if I lived in that neighborhood, I'll tell you that. You know those big fangs that Venom has? I would imagine when he has to brush his teeth, the only things that would really do it for him would be if he goes to a car wash place and those big things that spin around, those big brushes that brush a car. I don't know if the people working in the car wash place would feel very good about handling Venom, but if I were Venom, that's where I would go. It would be the easiest thing. When you talk about Venom, a lot of people have said to me, do you think alien symbiotes could really exist? As far as I'm concerned, anything is possible. We have no idea how many incredible things really exist in the universe. We've only scratched the surface of discovering what really lies around us all over. We don't know half of what's under the ocean yet. We don't know all the things that are deep under the earth, and we haven't even reached any distant stars. So I don't expect that the first Earthling who goes to another planet is going to find a symbiote, but I wouldn't be surprised if they exist, if they don't exist or do exist somewhere in the universe, in the galaxy, in the cosmos, because really the thing that makes writing science fiction so much fun is the fact that anything and everything is possible. The way science is going today and the way computers are evolving, I absolutely think, I am absolutely certain that we will have intelligent robots among us, working for us and working with us in the not too distant future. I mean, right now, there are little robots, you've probably seen them advertised, that you could buy, and it's dressed like a butler, and it'll serve drinks when you have company. There's the robot vacuum that'll vacuum your whole room. It starts in a certain area and goes. Well, those are primitive, but there's no reason why they won't have robots that can do very complex tasks. Look at the complex things that a computer does. If you put that hard drive inside of a robot and give it the right programming, it can do unlimited things. So I'm really surprised that it's taking so long to develop them. With the knowledge, the scientific knowledge we have today, I'm surprised there aren't robots among us right now. In fact, I've seen some people that could almost be robots, but we need not go into that. I think that any bit of literature that kids read that convey any facts or any information can be educational. When Spider-Man was bitten by a radioactive spider those many years ago, you have no idea how many letters I received from fans saying, I went to the library and I read up all about radioactivity, and I read up all about spiders, and I didn't know that they're called arachnids, and I didn't know this and that and the other. So if you can write something that's interesting and that catches a reader's imagination, the reader is certain to go to the library or to the internet or wherever and try to get more information about it, which is why I think reading is one of the greatest things in the world. And reading imaginative fiction is so great because it really expands your own imagination. So often I'm asked, how do you feel when you see a kid walking down the street and he's wearing a Spider-Man costume or a Spider-Man watch or a Spider-Man cap or any of the million Spider-Man things they sell? My first thought is, I hope Marvel is collecting a good royalty on this. But after that, I think, wow, it's just great to think that this little character that we dreamed up 40 years ago or more has remained as popular as he is. And that's a very, very satisfying thought, really. It makes you feel a little bit triumphant to know that you created something years ago and wrote it in such a way that people have enjoyed it and wanted to see more and still enjoy it years later. It's a great feeling. Not only do people all over wear Spider-Man things and play with Spider-Man gadgets, but there are people in Great Britain, in England, not long ago, a man climbed something and suspended himself from a tower in a little elevator type gadget, and he was dressed as Spider-Man, and he was up there in the air protesting something or other. And I remember some years ago in Chicago, somebody who called himself Spider-Man climbed one of the tallest buildings in Chicago. Both of these fellows eventually got arrested, but I think they enjoyed the publicity that they got. The only thing I used to worry about is what if one of them fell and hurt himself? It wouldn't look good for Spider-Man. But luckily, they all survived. Well, I must say I prefer the red and blue suit because I'm a loyalist. And that was the suit we originally gave Spider-Man. It's the suit that the whole world knows and loves. And I like sticking to it. But I will admit, for variety, it was really a lot of fun seeing Spider-Man in his black Venom outfit, so to speak, just so long as I know that he goes back to his regular red and blue suit eventually. I think one of my very first memories is me in a little, I must have been 4 years old or so, in a little cowboy suit that my parents bought me. And they took me to a photographer in the street. There was a man with a camera on a tripod, and for 10 cents he would take your picture, and he had a little pony there. And my parents lifted me up and put me on the pony, and the man took my picture. And I never quite understood why they wanted to take a picture of me on a pony in a cowboy suit, because I wasn't a cowboy, and I really couldn't ride ponies in those days. Then I remember after that, they put me in a sailor suit and took another picture of me a little while later. And isn't that funny? My first memories are me having 2 photographs taken of me in strange outfits. I really should have a more dramatic memory than that, but those are my first memories. You know, if someone were alone in a room with a giant red button on a table and a big sign saying, "Don't press this button," I think it would be exactly the same as walking in a park and seeing a bench that had been painted and a sign saying, "Wet paint. You've just got to touch it. You've just got to, is it really wet?" And that big red button, if you were in the room and there was nothing else to do, I don't see how you could avoid touching it, especially if it's real life and not just a science fiction or a horror story. If it's a horror story, you better not touch the button. But if it's real life, you'll touch the button and maybe a door will open or a bell will ring. I would take the chance. You know, Doc Octopus, or Doc Ock, or Dr. Octopus, has always been one of my favorites for a number of reasons. One, I love nicknames. And by getting a guy called Octavius and then being able to nickname him Doc Octopus. See, he was a professor whose name was Otto Octavius. And when he taught his class, as students do, they gave him the nickname of Dr. Octopus instead of Octavius. Then I gave him the nickname, of course I gave him the student's nickname too, because I wrote the story. But after they nicknamed him Dr. Octopus, I called him Doc Ock, which is my own nickname of a nickname, and as I say, I love nicknames. In coming up with villains, you're always trying to create something that is a little bit original, that people haven't seen before. And as far as I know, there hadn't been a guy with 4 tentacles
that could expand and retract and do all the things that Doc Ock's tentacles could do. So I felt that he was kind of an original character. Also, he wasn't really an ugly, monstrous, typical supervillain, but he was just an ordinary middle-aged professor, you know, with a roundish face and glasses, and that I thought was sort of unique too. But don't let his innocent appearance fool you. You wouldn't want to be caught in a fight with Doc Ock. When I first created Doc Ock, I really didn't have much of a backstory to him. He was just a fellow. Now, as I remember, he worked on radioactive material, and he had these two artificial arms which they used to go through a shielded device, and he was on one side of the device, and in manipulating the radioactive material, he couldn't touch it himself, so he had to use these two artificial arms. What he was teaching, I don't know. I'm no scientist. Something to do with nuclear fission and radioactivity or something. I just said he was a scientist working on radioactive material. So that was about all the backstory that I had for him. My guess is that in the future, new writers at Marvel will at some time or other come up with all sorts of backstory for him that I hadn't thought of. That's the nice thing. I come up with some nice, simple, basic, and then guys who are far cleverer than I am, they give it all the dimension and the roundness and the background that I never bothered to think of. I try not to make all the villains I did purely 100% evil. Actually, Dr. Octavius, when he was Dr. Otto Octavius, he was a good guy. I mean, he taught science or whatever he taught, and he was all right. But of course, he had this accident in the lab that grafted the tentacles to him and affected his personality. So he became evil. But I'd like to think that beneath all the sinister qualities he has, there's still a normal, nice guy trying to get out. Luckily, for the sake of our stories and keeping them interesting, it hasn't gotten out yet. Originally, when I started writing Spider-Man, I always like to give characters weaknesses, because if they're too powerful or if they can do anything, the stories aren't as much fun. When Spider-Man shot his webbing, I built in the fact that it would only last so long, and after a while, let's say it was holding a villain captive, but after a while the webbing would fall off. It wouldn't stay there forever, so Spider-Man better do what he had to do quickly while the fellow was trussed up. But after I stopped writing the series, other writers came along and they sort of forgot that angle. And now it seems that the webbing will last just as long as the writer wants it to last in any story. There doesn't seem to be a rule for it anymore. The thing I love about Spider-Man's webbing is he can do anything with it that you can imagine, really. The most obvious thing, the thing I liked the most, was whenever he was falling from a great height, he could just shoot it up over his head and form it into a parachute that would break his fall, or at least slow it down. He can obviously shoot it ahead of him and capture somebody who's running away, trip the guy up. He uses it to swing from building to building or tree to tree or wherever he's going. He can use it if somebody is aiming a gun at him. I've had him shoot the webbing where it goes inside the gun barrel. And if the person were to pull the trigger, he'd blow himself up. So almost anything you can think of. Sometimes, I remember years ago I did some stories where, as Peter Parker, he's sitting in a restaurant, let's say, eating, and he wants the sugar for his coffee. And the sugar is on the next table. And he can't get the waitress's eye. And if he makes sure that no one's looking, he'll zing a little webbing over, get the sugar, and spill it in, and nobody noticed him. So whatever I, as the writer, or any other writer can dream up, he can do with the webbing. It's sort of an all-purpose webbing.
I think virtually everything has been done. We've had characters who are very strong, who are very fast, who can fly, who can swim underwater, who can walk through walls, who can teleport, who can shoot all sorts of beams out of their eyes or their fingertips. So there again, the only original way to do that is to think of a beam that somebody shoots out of his or her fingers or eyes that in some way is different than other beams. It becomes increasingly difficult to get very original villains, which is why I'm glad I did them years and years ago, because I had a lot more scope at the time that I was doing it. There weren't as many around. Of all the superheroes I've created, I've been asked, who has the character trait that I most admire? Well, I guess I would have to say the Silver Surfer, because the way I did him anyway in the beginning, he was the closest thing to somebody who is totally good, almost saint-like. And there's no way that I can put myself in that class, but he'd be the guy that I would admire the most for his character. Trying to think of somebody on the flip side of that, what character that I've created has some character trait that is the most questionable? Maybe Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, because at least while I was writing it, he didn't always want to be a hero. He was more like me. He used to say, why should I go out and risk my life with you guys doing all of that? I'd rather be driving my Corvette and going out on a date. Now, I don't say that's questionable. To me, that's very human and very normal, and that's the way I think I would have felt. If I were president for one day, I've been asked, what would be the first thing I'd do? Well, I'd try to get an amendment put through the Constitution so that I could be the president for longer than one day. There isn't much the president can do without the approval of Congress and so forth. So I don't know. As I say, I'd just be trying to stay a little longer so I could get stuff done. If time travel were possible, I think my first choice might be to go back to the time of Leonardo da Vinci. Because of all the people who've lived before and after, I always thought that he was probably the most certifiable genius. And I'd like to get to know him and find out what made him tick and where did he get the ideas in those days for an airplane and a submarine and all the things that he did and the ability to paint the way he did. And I've always been fascinated by Da Vinci. It's funny, there are so many things I've never done. So many, I mean, I guess that goes for everybody. Nobody can do everything. One of the things that I've never done that I think I would really want to do is fly an airplane, myself, be the pilot. I love flying. My wife will not let me take flying lessons. She just says, come on. She said, there are other ways to spend your time. She's afraid of that. During World War II, I knew a girl who took me up in she was a member of the Women's Civil Air Command or something, and she flew her own plane. And she took me up in a little Piper Cub, and I had 15 minutes flying time because she let me take the controller, just a joystick, for 15 minutes. She said, you can't do anything wrong. If you want to go to the left, you do this. If you want to go to the right, you do that, and that's it. So I flew around, and she gave me a log book where I have my official 15 minutes flying time. I think ever since then I've wanted to be a pilot.